What happens to canvas when it gets wet? It retains the liquid and gets heavier. Now what happens when military load-bearing equipment made of canvas gets wet? A lot of problems, and the inevitable replacement of it with a more water-resistant material. This is exactly what happened to the US M1956 load-bearing system and the Stopgap system known as the M1967, designed as a response. To start, if you haven't already, consider watching our video covering the M1956, as it was the primary equipment system for many troops during most of the Vietnam War, and will be referenced both generally and specifically when it comes to pieces throughout this video. But to sum things up quickly, it had been introduced in the mid-1950s as a system to go along with the new M14 service rifle, which did not last long, being quickly replaced with the M16. However, the M1956 remained. The problem was the canvas that it was made of was designed without factoring in things like humidity as well as more wet environments, which Vietnam was chock full of. It had the nasty habit of retaining water, which would add approximately 40% to the overall weight. In addition, it could cause the growth of mold and mildew, and if the wearer had the luxury of getting enough free time to dry the equipment, he may notice the gear slowly warping and deteriorating due to dry rot. To add to this, a lot of the components, such as the ammo pouches, didn't accommodate the shorter M16 magazines. Plus, a number of items proved to be outdated and inconvenient at best, and nearly useless at worst. Overall, the M1956 gear was wearing out and becoming a pain, and so in 1965, the Army Concept Team in Vietnam, ACTIV for short, requested new gear that would be made out of nylon because of its fast drying and lightweight capabilities to be developed and tested. Answering the call, the Natick Development Center, aka Natick Labs, which developed 6 prototype sets that included a sleeping bag carrier, suspenders, a belt, an entrenching tool cover, 2 ammo pouches, canteen covers, a small pouch for either a first aid kit or compass, and a combat field pack. All of this was then sent over to Vietnam in January of 1966 and saw testing over the course of approximately 13 months, culminating with 550 additional sets referred to as M56 design nylon load-bearing equipment be created and sent over for large-scale testing, primarily by the 5th Special Forces, along with various recon companies of divisions in the country. Though a few tweaks were seen, by January of 1968, the final reports bearing the results were in, and the set was considered a success, seeing overall positive feedback. Most of the pieces were then designated as limited procurement type, which helped the US ARV, United States Army Republic of Vietnam, to put in a priority mass production request of close to 205,000 sets in April. These new sets would initially be called a few different things: M1956 lightweight load-carrying equipment, not to be confused with the already widely issued M1956 load-carrying equipment, lightweight load-carrying equipment, and lightweight nylon load-carrying equipment. It actually wasn't until 1970, when most of the components became standardized, did it finally gain the official designation of M1967. This designation was then seen in 2 names: first, Lightweight Load-Carrying Equipment Modernized M1967, and then finally Modernized Load-Carrying Equipment M1967, or MLCE M1967 for short. Confusing, right? Well, don't worry, it only gets harder to follow, as this is where the story sort of splits. The M1967 was a system based on and intended to supplement the equipment already issued to troops in Vietnam, not to fully replace it. That being said though, while these pieces were being created and distributed, testing and development of a much larger and fully conceptualized system was continuing, which wouldn't come to fruition until the 1970s. That is a bit of a somewhat separate story worthy of its own video, however we will touch on it slightly at the end. As for the M67, once put into production, the manufacturing process for most of the components proved to be more trouble than anticipated, as many pieces were made in smaller batches and ended up being sent over as quickly as possible, leading to sporadic and uneven circulation. This can be seen with the first deliveries through August of 1968, which were 25,000 belts, 16,000 first aid compass pouches, 16,000 canteen covers, and 14,000 sleeping bag carriers. In the following months, additional orders would arrive, continuing the already sporadic issuing. By 1971, though, the M1967 equipment had made its way rather unevenly to troops throughout the country and was often seen being worn alongside components of the M1956 system. So now would be a good point to take a look at these pieces up close, starting with the belt. Much like the belt of the M1956, the M1967 featured a vertical weave and came in two sizes, medium and large. The only real change was the switch to nylon from canvas, with the overall design remaining mostly the same, which was seeing the option to adjust from both ends, incorporating rows of eyelets on the top and bottom to allow the hanging of older equipment. They were made of brass instead of aluminum though, and the same buckles, those being the older ball style and the slightly newer Davis quick release. Though these quick release, more commonly known as T-slot or simply Davis buckles, named after the primary manufacturer Davis Aircraft Products, began being put onto some M1956 belts, their use on the newer M67 seemed to have been more prevalent. However, they continued to encounter snagging and random unbuckling. Because many belts after the M1967 system look very similar, coupled with commercial ones being abundant, the easiest way to identify originals are as follows. If they have a Davis buckle, make sure they're nylon and the buckles have Davis or a tiny windmill with US underneath stamped onto them. If they don't have a Davis buckle, there are two indicators to look for. The first is a square fabric information tag sewn on the inside, which denote them as newer since M1967 belts had their info stamped directly to them. The second are the 2 versus 3 rows of eyelets. Every belt after the M1967 only had 2, as the hook adjuster system, which used the middle row, was replaced with clinch adjusters. Similar in overall shape, but not much else, were the suspenders. Known officially as field pack suspenders, they featured a basic H-back design due to the 4 straps meeting with a cross-section. The material was changed to feature nylon fabric and webbing, allowing for improved comfort and obviously better defense against water. The biggest changes, though, came in the form of the metal components used to attach the suspenders to the belt, as well as hook other items onto them. The 4 primary attachment hooks were similar in design to later M1956 hooks, which featured a tension tongue. This was altered to a sort of cover around the actual hook component to keep them in place, but also to prevent snagging and potential bending. These would officially and aptly be designated as snap hook side retaining. 2 additional ones were seen on the upper portion to easily connect the field pack and sleeping bag carrier. The 4 adjustment buckles seen on the front and back were also redesigned, ditching the movable snap-down ones of the M1956 in favor of a single piece that would utilize friction as a means of preventing the straps from becoming undone. Excess strapping could then be fed through the small nylon loops seen around the webbing portions. Lastly, the front shoulder section saw 2 fixed fabric loops which could be used to hang or attach smaller items, as well as 2 metal D-rings which had the primary purpose of anchoring the ammo pouch's securing straps. Next was a small pouch used to store a first aid packet or compass. These remained mostly unaltered in design, really only changing the fabric from canvas to nylon, with its connection method continuing to be a single slide keeper. The only evolution it saw was the snap button, which was originally plastic but eventually was replaced with a metal one. Like the previous system, the ammunition pouches were a bit diverse and saw new introductions after the fact, which has seemed to cause a bit of confusion due to a few factors. That said, it appeared that there were 3 primary pouches seen: one to hold 20-round M14 magazines, one to hold 20-round M16 magazines, and a third to hold 30-round M16 magazines. Let's go in that order as it gets a little bit strange. The M14 magazine pouch is perhaps the oddest component, as it technically was the only pouch to be a part of the originally designed system, yet wasn't used in Vietnam. Obviously, testing of this nylon equipment was happening while the M14 was still in service. However, by the time these pieces made it into the country, the M16 was already being circulated to forces. This one is without a doubt the most seldom seen component due to its late classification as limited procurement type in 1971, followed by standardization in 1972. However, by that time, the M14 was really only being used for specialty purposes, and so it didn't really see much use anywhere. It was almost a carbon copy of the older universal pouch seen with the M1956, featuring a single front flap, stabilizer strap on the back, and 2 side tabs to hold things such as grenades. The only minor alterations were it being made of nylon and thus not having as much of a rigid design as the canvas predecessor, though plastic support pieces were seen inside, and a single plastic latch fastener to close the front of it rather than the slide-through canvas tab method. This new closing method was actually designed to be used for Arctic equipment, as it was intended to be easily opened and closed while wearing gloves. Next up is the 20-round M16 pouch, which again was almost identical to the M56 ones. It could hold 4 magazines, and like the aforementioned M14 pouch, its only changes were really the switch to nylon and the plastic latch fastener. One addition, however, was an 11-inch sort of ribbon band on the inside. This would be placed under the M16 magazines with the unattached side sticking up. Wearers simply had to pull up on it to help free the magazines from the pouch in the event they got stuck or users were in a rush to grab them. What's curious about this piece is that its development essentially was just a continuation of the original canvas one, as that one had been added to the M1956 once the M16 entered the scene. This essentially meant that it sort of wasn't part of the M1967 but was issued with them and technically was a part of it. Regardless though, the pouch was the first piece to be standardized in 1968 and was one of the last to be canceled in 1975. Finally, the third and perhaps most significant one was the 30-round M16 pouch, which appeared in 1969. Early years of the M16's usage saw smaller 20-round magazines. However, starting in 1965, experiments had been conducted with ones that allowed an additional 10 rounds, bringing them to 30. Though there was still a bit of growing pains in that development when the M1967 system was being created, this was taken into account, and thus the 30-round version was added. However, it should be noted that the design of this pouch, like the 20-round version, was separate from the primary system tests. Because of its disconnected and sort of delayed entry, its usage during the war was more random than most of the other pieces. Now, its overall design does appear very similar to the M14 pouch, however the biggest difference to it was the curved appearance of it, which can be seen from the side. Being that the M14's standard magazines were box-shaped, while the M16's extended ones were curved, it naturally made sense to accommodate them properly with a new pouch. This pouch, though not as wide scale as the 20-round version, did become a more common, albeit slightly altered, design with the later US load-bearing systems used throughout the rest of the 20th century. Again, as with the M1956, many forces did alter these pouches by sometimes cutting off the support straps on the back and the grenade hanger straps on the sides. Continuing on, we have the entrenching tool case, which is something of an interesting thing as it had to be changed during its testing due to another development project that was separate from the rest of the components, one relating to the entrenching tool's overall design. Up until then, the shovel had been much like it had been for decades, a single long handle that folded at a point where it met the spade. This caused issues as the handle would awkwardly stick out and down with the potential to hit legs, get snagged, and generally get in the way whilst it was attached to a belt or other component. That's where the aluminum lightweight entrenching tool comes in. Not only did it solve the handle problem by adding a second point of articulation, it also lightened the overall weight, included a proper hand grip, and added a serrated blade on one side for cutting. Now, the original design for the carrier was essentially an updated version of the M1956. That being one that incorporated an angled tab and lower strap to attach and secure the M8A1 scabbard used for the M5, 6, and 7 bayonets. This was because the team behind it was anticipating the continued use of the older style E-tool. However, when the new design was revealed, the pouch had to be changed. Like many of these pieces, there were likely several experimental and rarely seen versions. Here are 4 which really show how many iterations were tested. The first is designed around the older E-tool model, really keeping the same features as the M1956 version, except the 2 snaps are replaced with the single latch fastener. Next is the same M1956 design, but with 2 snap buttons versus 1, and was intended for the new E-tool. Third is a close to finalized design which essentially did away with the entire secondary features seen on the M1956, opting for a single latch fastener on the front. The weird thing about this one is the addition of the older hook attachment method, which had more or less been phased out with the previous generation of web gear. Based on the nylon strap below the hook, it appears this was a second attachment method in that a belt could be fed through it. The fourth version was the finalized design, which was pretty much the same as the just seen one, but replaced the hook attachment with the standard slide keeper. The insides of it were reinforced with hard plastic to protect the nylon from sharp edges, while also adding a single eyelet at the bottom to drain water. Due to its somewhat disconnected origins from the rest of the load-carrying system, along with its standardization coming in 1969, it was not given the M1967 designation, but was still considered a part of it. Being an almost identical copy of the M1961 field pack, which itself was an updated version of the M1956 field pack, the M1967 field pack saw only a few minor changes. Those were, obviously, a switch over to nylon, 2 small metal grommets on each side to allow for the hanging of anything utilizing the wire hook attachment method, the addition of 2 horizontal bands on the back, each of which featured a snap button button which were used to secure the pack to the suspenders, and an updated connector system which didn't require an additional adapter when worn up towards the shoulders, as needed with the M1956. The interesting thing about these packs is that they were not really used by the Army, as higher-ups had requested the use of a larger, more efficient tropical-style rucksack. So they weren't really seen alongside soldiers. However, the Marine Corps had no problem with them, and so they were used along with their own load-bearing system, which was also referred to as the M1967, though was very different. Though the pack wasn't as widely used by the Army as other pieces, it did get a second life in the form of the Field Pack Training, a slightly adjusted piece first seen in 1977, but that, like the Marine Corps M1967 system, is another story. Once again, the Canteen covers saw minimal changes as far as the overall design goes. It retained its general shape, but as with most other items, switched over to nylon. The biggest changes were seeing 4 vertical stitches along the front to hold in the same acrylic pile lining as seen with its predecessors, as well as the inclusion of a very small pocket attached to one side that was closed via a strip of Velcro used to carry water purification tablets. Finally, early versions of these covers featured plastic snap buttons, however these changed to metal in 1971. Perhaps the biggest and most welcome change was the new sleeping bag carrier. Gone was the Gordian knot mess that was the previous one. Replacing it was a much simpler single 12 by 14 inch, or about 30 by 35.5 centimeter rectangular piece of nylon that was treated to be water repellent. This piece essentially would wrap around a sleeping bag, poncho, poncho liner, shelter half, or whatever else a soldier may carry, and would simply be secured by the 2 straps that would wrap around and be fed into the same friction-style buckles. It also included 3 Velcro loops, 2 that lined up with 2 additional D-rings, and a single, larger one placed down towards the other side, right in between them. These would act sometimes as direct connection points or as stabilizers, depending on how the wearer attached the piece to the system, that being either on the upper back or down by the belt. Now, due to the overall nature of the system and it being a sort of stopgap temporary one, a bit of information isn't clearly defined, as some of these components have been seen being used in other ways. Additionally, some have speculated that the larger Velcro pieces could be used to fit around the cross-section of the M1956 suspenders, which would make sense considering the M1967 system from the start was meant to be used in conjunction with the M56 one. Whatever the case was, the final element of the piece was 2 long Velcro strips on the reverse side, which were used to hold smoother items in place such as ponchos and shelter halves. And those were pretty much the main components of the M1967. As you may have gathered from that breakdown, things seemed a little weird and disjointed. A lot of the elements appeared separate in both design and procurement, which sort of results in an almost slapped together and not fully defined overall feel. This was pretty much the case, and the main reason for that was that officials wanted these pieces to be sent over as fast as possible to help fix some of the issues Canvas had. The limited procurement status type allowed this, but also caused a delay in standardization. To compare, the M1956 load-carrying equipment at the start was a complete and fully implemented system that included its own dedicated manual going over how to set it up and use it. The M1967, on the other hand, was issued in a disjointed, sporadic manner and instead was primarily highlighted in the small section of the technical manual 10-276. Hot Weather Clothing and Equipment, which was released in 1970, as that was the year most pieces became standardized. In this manual, a chapter outlines load-carrying equipment, but only talks about the 67 gear, referred to as lightweight nylon load-carrying equipment, in a very small section. It even features a diagram that includes the original versions of the entrenching tool cover, as well as the rarely seen M14 ammo pouch. It then essentially tells the reader to refer to the M1956 manual. Details on description, fitting, and principle of use of components of the standard M1956 individual load-carrying equipment, which are the same as those for the lightweight load-carrying equipment, except for differences noted, are contained in FM 21-15. In essence, the system truly was a supplemental stopgap, one meant to work in tandem with the widely used canvas pieces already in country. Looking beyond its confusing statuses, distribution, and various designations, it was the first step in a much grander development as the United States Army was well on its way in creating a branch-wide replacement for the M1956. Known as the Linclo Project, or Lightweight Individual Clothing and Equipment, it would see another system that would eventually spawn the M1972, later known as the All-Purpose Lightweight Individual Load Carrying System, or ALICE for short. So what was the fate of the M1967? Well, considering shipments of it began arriving in the second half of 1968, it only saw a few years of active service as U.S. forces began withdrawing in 1970. Come 1973, most were gone, save a select few, such as Marine security guards, who stayed until the very end in 1975. During the fall of Saigon, additional forces were sent in to reinforce and aid in the evacuations of both the Defense Attaché Office and U.S. Embassy as part of Operation Frequent Wind. Seen as a dramatic conclusion of the war, many photos and videos were taken, some of which show U.S. forces. Of these, a few, such as this one, show pieces of the M1967 mixed with others, giving us an example of not only its intended usage, but also confirmation the system was utilized until the very end. As for foreign use, there have been mentions that certain pieces were tested by British and Australian forces to varying extents, though no full adoption was seen. But perhaps the most significant use came by way of the South Vietnamese Army, which had been supported by the United States throughout the war in just about all forms. Overall, though, by 1973, most pieces ceased being produced, with a few continuing on or being rolled into Alice, granted with some minor tweaking and renaming. However, certain items left over from the war continued to be seen sporadically by certain troops for various purposes through the next few decades, eventually all being worn out and replaced. Today, many of these components are still available on the surplus market, with certain ones being seen in brand new unissued condition, such as suspenders and entrenching tool covers. This is definitely an interesting element, as it shows that numerous pieces were created but never really made their way into the hands of forces in Southeast Asia. At the end of the day, though, the system did what it was supposed to do: supplement and help alleviate certain issues relating to an aging system used by troops in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, while a brand new, all-encompassing one was being worked on, one that could be used in just about all regions of the world. Hopefully this video was informative and entertaining to those who watched and helped answer a few questions about this very peculiar, shortly seen load-carrying system. If you enjoyed it, perhaps leave a like and subscribe if you have not already. If you don't feel like it, it's all good. Just be sure to check back soon for more of the history of right here on Uniform History.